Thank you for your interest in the special audio recording of a Teach 2016 workshop. This audio file is a free resource from USA, Canada Sunday School and Discipleship Ministries Regional Office. Recorded at 2016 Teach Conference held at Springdale Church of the Nazarene in Cincinnati, Ohio. We extend appreciation to the presenter who gave permission for the recording to be distributed as a training resource, and pray that it will be a blessing to your ministry. If you have any comments about the content or quality of this recording, please send them to stmi.nazarene.org or call 1-877-240-2417.
Well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I know some of the workshops are starting at different places, but I believe, and I also know that I am standing between you and lunch, which is the one place people who teach for a living do not like to be. I don't know what's worse, right before lunch or having a class right after lunch. Maybe that is worse, who knows, before it's over with. I'm Dr. Dean Blevins. I'm at Nazarene Theological Seminary, and the workshop today is asking the right questions, motivating students through our question selection. And I'm glad you're here. It's really fun for me to be a part of the Teach Conference and to be able to contribute this way. Thought we'd start, particularly a workshop on questions with questions. I mean, it seems to make sense from that standpoint. You know, when you think about students that are, and I don't know what age levels are represented here in the room, but when you think about students in general, what tends to not motivate them, but tends to cause them not to respond to questions? I mean, what are the things that could be asked that really might make them afraid of the kinds of questions? What comes to mind? Giving the wrong answer, a lot of times sort of feeling like they're on jeopardy from that standpoint. They got the is a part of that. What else? Why else might students be afraid?
This is horrible, but I have given the wrong answer and someone laughing.
Okay, so
that's happened.
Okay, so a lot of times it's how the other students might react to the very question, their answer is a part of that, and even how they might stand out as a result of it. Anything else come to mind? I'm not looking for a right answer, just wondering what else might be there that would prohibit students from answering questions.
Students can just absorb into the crowd, but once you're asked a question, they suddenly come out in front of the crowd.
Okay, yeah, so a student might normally just be hanging back as a part of the group, and the minute they even open their mouth to speak, they feel like the spotlight's on them and they kind of step out as a part of that. And that puts them in a different place within the group dynamic from that standpoint. Well, why would a teacher be afraid to ask questions? I mean, what reasons would cause teachers to sort of be afraid to ask a question in any kind of group setting, any kind of situation? Anything come to mind?
Get sidetracked.
Sometimes being sidetracked, the famous rabbit trails, right? Where, you know, I know the question I ask, I'm hearing the answer you're giving, but it has absolutely no correlation to the question I ask. Okay. Anything else other than rabbit trails?
Afraid of what might come back and you not knowing how to answer it.
Okay. Yeah, the question you ask comes back as a question, and now suddenly you're stuck in the midst of that conversation. Or even sometimes it might be an answer, but you're going, I don't know where you got that. And so you're suddenly in a kind of a pinch to try to figure out what's meant by that. Anything else? Again, I'm not looking for a right answer. It's just kind of helping us think. No? Well, can you think of a worst case scenario? Or imagine one maybe where a kind of question and answer session flopped, where it just went south in a hurry. Okay? Anybody? True confessions? Or something you've observed is probably a better
one.
one.
I was in a school class one time teaching and asked a question about, we were talking about the virgin birth, and one of the people in the class suddenly went on, well, I think all girls should be married by the time they're 13 or 14.
conversation.
Just, wow, where do you go with that?
Yeah, I know. I hear that. For the sake of people who might listen to that, that's so you started with the virgin birth conversation, and somebody declared in the midst of
Yeah, she's
that.
probably 13 or 14, and I think all girls should be married by that age.
So,
Ouch.
okay, so a declaration that we should do kind of the Amish thing and make sure everybody's married by 13 or 14. I'm glad I wasn't a part of that group. I guess the best way to say it. Let me give you a couple of mine that come out of my history of observation that kind of help set the tone of what we're trying to do today. One of them, before I was in Christian ministry, I actually worked in broadcast television, behind the camera. No, I was not in front. That would be a scary thought. But I was behind the camera, and I never will forget, we always did a kind of a community service show in the local television station where you bring in lots of public groups, kind of talk about what's going on in the community. And we had a brand new host for this 30-minute show, and she only had one group to bring in. It was a Junior Area Chamber of Commerce, the JCs, and they had a big boat show. And she had this information sheet in front of her. Well, that's exactly what they had in front of them too. And so the question were like, so I understand that the show is going to start on Thursday, right? Yes. Well, it says that you had about 50,000 people last year and you're hoping for about 65,000 this year, right? Well, I understand that, weather can make a big difference in what's happening. Yes? And I hear that you had 3 crashes last year. That's correct. Within about 5 minutes of this 30-minute show, she burned through every one of her questions. And within 5 minutes, they had burned through everything they had on their talking points on the sheet. We had 25 minutes left. You want to talk about the most painful 25 minutes in broadcast television history that I've ever known. Obviously, this person was not a major interviewer for a major network, but it was learning on the job. The other one, the whole idea of young adults. I was a minister in a church in Southern California, and I had a young couple that was in charge of the young married class, and they came to me, and they were really sort of distraught. They had a vibrant young marrieds ministry everywhere but Sunday school. They would have a picnic or a get-together, or they would just say, let's just go out after worship, and they probably have 20, 25, well, probably 26, good even number, come out and join them. And so, and the people just loved them in their ministry. But in Sunday school, they couldn't get hardly anyone to show up, and they didn't understand why. And so the guy that was teaching class looked at me. I was an assistant pastor at the time in discipleship. He says, could you help me figure out what's going on? And I said, sure. I said, what's your lesson? And he lesson plan, he kind of showed it to me. And I said, probably the best thing for me to do is just come and observe next week. So my wife and I, and we had not been married that long ourselves, decided to set in on his presentation. And he started the lesson this way. He says, today we're going to talk about temptation. And we're going to talk about the kind of temptations that young married couples have in the early part of their marriage. And so I want to know, what temptation have you had this past week that really threatened your marriage, and how have you overcome it? That was the first question. I'm looking around, and everybody's kind of studying their feet. They're seated, but, it's kind of like all of a sudden, hey, I've got sandals down here. They were looking at it, and I look over at my wife. She says, if you open your mouth. I saw that finger pointed at me. Now, the reason I say that is that a lot of times we ask questions, but when you think about questions at large, what goes wrong? When you kind of back away from the kinds of questions, what's going on in those kinds of moments when those scenarios do go south? What's happening in those moments? What do you think? Any ideas?
I think people are shutting down. I mean, they're protecting themselves because they don't want to answer. They don't want to be that vulnerable right off the gate.
So a lot of times it's about the vulnerability of how they feel from that standpoint. Yeah. Anything else?
They're probably saying, I don't think I'll come back.
Yeah, they're probably at that point, they're probably going, oh, gee, I think I've got another schedule. Well, I'm going to suggest three things. I'm aware of the time for this workshop, and I know you came for information as well as conversation. So I hope you don't mind that. One of the tough things about teaching on asking questions is you really want to do it through questions. But I also know for all of us in time pressure times, you also want to know answers in the midst of it. So let me suggest three things that I think really happen. One is that sometimes what goes wrong is we're not thinking about the kind of question that we're asking. And so that's one thing I'm going to talk about. The second thing that sometimes goes wrong in the motivation is we're not thinking about where we're aiming that question, sort of the target of that question. And the third thing that really shows up, particularly in that last scenario, is the threat level behind the question. So let me talk about sort of the what types of questions, who's the audience, and what's the threat level of that question. I think those are three important things. By the way, the PowerPoint, if you're interested in it as a PDF, you can email me direct, or you can contact Sunday School Ministries, SDMI, and I'm sure they'll be able to provide that for you as well. Well, there are four basic kinds of questions and there's one way to think about it is just through the sort of organization of them, that there are factual, analytic, productive, and evaluative types of questions. Now, why would knowing that there are different types of questions be important? Why would that be important?
Because it tells you the threat level that the people might feel.
Because at one level it tells you the threat level of what people might feel as a result of that, how that question's formed. That's a good answer. Anything else? Again, this is not, can you guess what I'm thinking? But anything else that comes to mind, knowing the different types of questions?
Requires different answers.
Different types of answers come out of the different types of questions, yeah.
I was going to say the same thing.
Same thing.
There's four types of questions. There's going to be four types of answers,
You-
and that's going to determine what kind of question I want to ask,
Yeah.
depending on what kind of answer I'm trying to get.
Yeah, a lot of times really, what is the answer I'm looking for? Now, that doesn't have to be the one right answer, but what kind of answer am I looking for really shapes the kind of question I want to ask and really does influence the threat level as a result of that as well. Let me walk through these. I'm going to do it quickly so we have time for discussion at the end. Some of this information I'm sure you already know, but it's just one of those ways of kind of reminding us of the kinds of questions. First kind of question, these factual questions really are, well, they're asking for information. I call them data questions. And they usually have one right answer as a part of that. Can you think of an example of a good kind of factual question you might ask in say, a Sunday school or a small group? Anything come to mind where the answer would be pretty obvious? Huh?
Who is Mary?
Who is Mary? Particularly the mother of Jesus. We often joke about the Jesus answer question, right? The Sunday school answer. Have you heard that famous story, what's round and fluffy with a round tail and long ears? And Johnny says, it sounds like a bunny rabbit, but it's got to be Jesus. But many times factual questions are important. Names of the 12 apostles, right? Just simple ways. Now, these can be really positive because they really do build base for discussion. And sometimes they're really good if you've got a rabbit trail. They help a group get back on tangent. One of the things I've really found important about factual questions is that and this is not just an adult, I mean, I've seen this in all age levels, but particularly with adults, if you really get a sense you're about to go down a long rabbit trail, just asking, so what do you find that in this passage? What's the data in the passage that helps? It just begins to redirect them back to the conversation around the passage you're trying to teach. Does that make sense? And it really, particularly for young people and for children, you're checking to know what their base of knowledge is. You're really building the kinds of bases of knowledge through very straightforward questions so that you know what they know and they can be reinforced in that knowledge. Now, the negative is who's determining what are the right answers? Teacher. Matter of fact, on Mary, I mean, we might go, well, which Mary? Right? Mary Magdalene? Mary the mother of Jesus? Well, some ways the teacher's already set the context by which passage you're studying in that moment, right? But they tend to be, the teacher gets to pick the questions. They can be difficult for generating discussion. My first illustration was all about data. 50,000 people, 3 boat wrecks. And most of the time, if you ask those as data-oriented questions, you either get the one right answer or you get a yes or no. And so building conversation can be pretty tough. And the other problem is that sometimes you get lots of information, but you're not getting really transformation of their understanding. And I'm thinking about the presentation this morning, where in some ways information doesn't always guarantee transformation. And there's a really interesting story about a young boy who was an exemplary Bible quizzer. Was one of the best Bible quizzers. Matter of fact, they won the award in their church for the amount of biblical knowledge that they had, and they were sort of heralded as an exemplary child when it came to understanding the Bible. Anybody heard this story? Any idea who the person was? Nikita Khrushchev. Now, for some people, you may have to Google who that is. But information is not always transformation, and so that's part of it. The second types of questions are analytical questions. Now, these are built on facts, so they start with information that you have. They provide analysis and conclusions, and they do include sometimes a range of possible answers because of the way you're engaging. Can you think of examples of when we might use sort of, and I know the word analytical may sound kind of fancy, but when we might use kinds of analytical types of questions in our teaching? Anything come to mind?
Like when Jesus asked the woman of the well why he should give the children's food to dogs.
So that in some ways trying to go, how is it that we understand what that's going on? So they have to analyze it, know something about the background from that standpoint. So many times when Jesus asks a question in Scripture, inviting people to think, well, what's going on in the context around that is a kind of analytical question. I don't know if you've ever had people do comparing 2 different types of verses of Scripture and saying, so what's Jesus' understanding of the Beatitudes, for instance, in the Sermon on the Mount compared to Moses' teaching of the 10 Commandments. And in a way, what you're asking to do is begin to analyze 2 different passages of Scripture and look for points of similarity, but also points of difference. A simple question of, what's similar and what's different sometimes is a simple way of thinking about it. So listing comparison questions can be used a lot of times. It's important that this is really a positive because it's more than simplistic answers. And it does involve the students thinking. They're not merely regurgitating back to you something they've read. They're not merely looking down at the most obvious thing that's there and restating it. The Sunday school answer I mentioned before, you're actually challenging them to think about the Scripture and think about its importance or think about their daily lives. I mean, it's one thing to say, how are you tempted every day? It's another thing to say, when you think about the way, say, the media works, what are 2 or 3 ways in which the media tend to tempt people in the messages that the media give? Now, that's an analytical question. Does that make sense? Because they have to think about what's out there and analyze it. One of the things that's a negative is that analytical questions take time. I mean, I'm even aware when I ask something like that, you got to pause. People have to have time to think. And as a teacher, one thing I've learned is that when I'm asking an analytical question and I'm short on time, it might be best just not to ask it. And I don't know if you've ever been in one of those situations where somebody will ask a very difficult analytical question and they immediately give you the answer. And that can be pretty demeaning because a lot of times people have to think it through. And sometimes it can take too much time just breaking down the information rather than connecting it. I've been a part of Bible studies where we do really deep, in-depth study of one verse of Scripture. Yeah, but by the time you're over, you're going, what difference does that make? And so again, analytical questions are good, but they have to serve a particular purpose if you're going to use them. Third form is slightly different. These are productive questions. Now, productive questions are a lot more open-ended. They're not seeking one answer, so there's a lot of creativity. It can be playfulness. There can be brainstorming going on as a part of what we're doing. And then a lot of times we do that, and then you can come up afterwards and say, can you support it with facts? But it's important that you start with these kinds of brainstorming questions. Can you think of a kind of brainstorming question that you've heard or used recently, or maybe listened in on that other people might have used? Anything come to mind?
We just changed our logo in our youth group. Does that count?
Well, a lot of times if you're thinking about all the different types of logos that were probably suggested, and probably some of them really out of the box, say, what kind of a logo do we need? Oh, I'm in trouble now. But just having that gives them space to be creative, and that's important. A lot of times, even the question I used earlier, it was analytical because I used the word 3. But if I just say, can you name some temptations that people face through what they are exposed to in media, now you could have 50 different responses in the way that's done. And so all you've done is by removing the restriction of 3 and just saying some or in general, now you give people space to talk about all kinds of things. What's really positive is it does generate new thinking and new questions. Often this is one place where you get lots of good information that comes to you, and it gives them permission to sort of think outside the box. The negative is it can be a lengthy process, and this is where tangents will occur. This is also where those logos you would never show anybody on the face of the earth pop up as a suggestion before it's over with. But I really want to stress to you, there's a real strategic use for these kinds of open questions. Even in some ways, because if nothing else, you're saying to people, your ideas are important, and you're free to be playful. It kind of creates a different kind of environment. Fourth approach are evaluative questions. Now these ask for a value judgment and opinions, though they can be broad. And often at this point it explores assumptions and really invites personal involvement. A lot of times value questions are the why questions. Why do people struggle when it comes to temptation? Or why are young married couples vulnerable to certain types of temptation? And what you're asking is for them to make an interpretive judgment in what they offer. Can anybody think of other times when we use valuative questions? Anything come to mind?
In the application of what you were...
Yeah, so whenever you've been teaching, you say, now, what should we do about this, and why is that important in our lives? You're not only just asking just a kind of productive question, but you're asking them to offer their own interpretation of that lesson. And they're investing in that lesson. It's interesting because it often begins where people really are on a particular subject. Both, and this is really important if you're thinking about questions, both as you open a lesson, where are they? But particularly as you think about the interpretation and the application of a lesson, where are they? That's where a lot of times you really will hear where they are and the way they respond to that. The danger is that student investment sometimes, because suddenly now, we go back all the way to that early illustration, it's not merely I've opened my mouth and the spotlight's on me, but now I'm telling you what I think's important. And I hope you hear in that, now there's a piece of my personhood that's out on the limb with the way I respond to that question. Does that make sense? And sometimes it's a very simple turn of the phrase between a productive question and an evaluative question, where some ways that people are faced by temptation, what is the primary problem, or what would you see as the problem with temptation in young people's lives? Suddenly they're not just thinking out loud, they're trying to offer you their opinion. Now this is important because now they're invested in the lesson. But for you as a teacher, it's also important because now they're invested in the lesson. And the way you respond and the way other people respond may make all the difference in the world in that crucial moment. Does that make sense? So the kinds of questions we use carry a lot of implications in how people are motivated or not in the way in which we utilize those. Now I'm going to give you some pointers as we go along, but I wanted you to be thinking about that and thinking about the next time you teach, what types of questions are you using? I'm going to give you some prompts on what to do. Any questions or comments so far with what we're talking about? Okay, all right. Like I said, I know I'm standing between you and lunch, so I'm going to keep going, but I'll take time at the end also for other kinds of questions. Second big point I really want you to think about is not only the type of question, but who's your audience? Who is, and I have in parentheses up there, who is your target audience? That's language that may sound like it comes out of marketing, but I'm using it in a slightly different way. When you ask the question, who's supposed to answer that? And what kind of audience are they designed to represent? Because often that's where, in some ways, they start to feel the target, many times right on their chest or their back as a result of it. You can ask very general questions aimed at everyone. You know, what do people think? What do most people understand? And what's really interesting is that people can offer perspectives other than their own. When you ask a question with a general audience in mind, people can take different positions. They can even argue that there's another perspective out there, maybe not even one they agree with, because we're just talking about people in general, right? And if you say, you know, the kids at your school, what did the kids at your school think about? Well, that's a pretty big pool. Or if you go, when you think about the youth in this community, how would they respond to? And you can get within that kind of a question all kinds of answers. I hope you hear the kind of productive, in part because you've given them such a broad audience to work with in their own responses that they get a chance to communicate to you. Now, I think I may mention this again in a later slide, but I'll go ahead and tell you now. Many times you'll hear their opinion as well. But if it's hidden in this big audience, suddenly, even if they've opened their mouth, that spotlight is not on them at this point. They can almost stay back in the crowd even as they offer answers, because you have given them permission to throw out all kinds of things. The second level is community. And when I say community, I'm talking about the community of whatever your teaching environment is, whether it is a classroom, a small group, a youth group, a children's church, an adult retreat. It's going from they, the big group, to we, this community. And so you have begun to sort of narrow the audience. You're starting to focus the target. You're starting to imply that there is actually implications, at least for the group, when it's all said and done. So the perspective is still broad, but I hope you begin to hear there's already a little bit more of a sense of investment and commitment. I mean, it's one thing to say, how are they affected by? It's another thing to say is, what difference does that make for us? It's the we and they versus they moment that suddenly your class starts to feel the boundaries being drawn up at that point. And they can still be pretty broad, but obviously now it depends. I mean, if you've got a small group of 3, that we is pretty limited, right? But if you've got a class, an adult class or a youth group of 50, it's still a pretty good crowd to be able to start offering responses to the questions that you're answering. The key is the next level, the personal. What do you think, or where are you in this struggle? These are individually focused. They many times have a very, they demand a kind of high self-disclosure, and they really have many times a question of expected commitment. Now there are moments these are important. You know, what is Christ saying to you? What is Christ's expectation in your life? How are you challenged in this giving moment? But I hope you hear in that question a really different kind of level of vulnerability and intensity. Does that make sense? And so as much as I want to talk to you about motivation, it's also thinking about what's the audience you're asking them to speak for in the answer that they're about to provide. I think all three of these are important, but which audience you choose sometimes makes all the difference in whether or not you get their commitment into answering those questions. Anybody with me? Any questions?
If you're asking aimed at the general, then quite often the answer given, though you asked it in a general sense, the person giving the answer may be feeding something that's highly personal.
Yeah, but they.
Safer way to say it.
And they just have a safer way to say it. So one of the things I really love about general questions, what do most people think? A lot of times, and I teach a lot of adults, right? And so and I'll ask that like a productive question. So what do most people think? And then normally the first 2 or 3 responses I get are kind of productive, open-ended. And then all of a sudden I'll get, and I can almost name the people I know, I'm going to get a evaluative, well, this is what I think most people think. Well, be honest with you, by then, I, as a teacher, go, wow, there's a lot more value than just open-endedness in this, and this is a lot more about what I think than what everybody thinks. But even as a teacher, I don't have to be put on spot. I mean, I hope you hear there's 2 levels of vulnerability, because suddenly this person can make that, and I can go, well, thank you, that's a great observation, but I can keep moving on, as opposed to them saying, well, this is what I think, and now me as a teacher, I have to deal with that in that moment. Well, I appreciate your opinion, but where's some other opinions out there? It's just a simple way of allowing people to really still offer something without them being put on the spot by having this general audience as the background, and for you as a teacher not necessarily have to be put on the spot. And sometimes if you can keep the conversation going the kind of general way, you actually get 2 or 3 other people to contribute, and then you can come back around and address any one of those, including that very personal observation, but you can do it in a pastoral way because you've got enough information out there to work with. Does that make sense?
As an illustration of that, my home church years ago as a teenager, we had it's actually a young adult Sunday school class, and the question was put out in a general sense, what keeps people from coming to church? Why do some people not come to church? They were just trying to brainstorm some ideas. What are some things? Well, one person in the class suggested, her first answer was too many hypocrites in the church. And then somebody else in the class responded and said, that is a problem, that's an issue, but somebody once told me that if you let the hypocrites come between you and God, they're still closer to God than you are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, what she didn't realize is that the woman who made that first answer, her husband doesn't come because of hypocrites in the church. So the other person who responded immediately made it very personal by saying, the hypocrites in this church are still closer than your husband is. She didn't know she said that.
She didn't even know. Yeah.
But it got very personal very fast, and it actually caused a disruption in the class for a while.
Yeah.
People stopped coming, and it really disrupted the community they had there.
Okay. So
they didn't understand that personal dynamic.
Yeah. And in some ways, that's the moment where the way one person answers that very kind of personal, evaluative way, and the other person's response may not even be intended to respond to that, but it creates that kind of tension that if you can say, well, let's keep the general audience in mind. Now, as people know each other, those evaluative questions come up. I mean, I think we recognize that. But it becomes one of the ways in which by keep just thinking, so let's talk about this general target. That becomes really important sometimes in diffusing those kinds of tense moments. They will happen. You can't, I'm going to be the first one to say, you can't control the outcome of every question you ask. You'll just stop asking questions. But if you can redirect through the next question you choose, that becomes one of the important things. Let me walk through some more stuff. That was a great observation, though. Thank you for that. I hope you hear that what I'm really getting at in maximizing questions is by recognizing how the questions we choose create threat or they create a sense of openness. And if I've got one sort of takeaway from this workshop, it is how do I ask questions and recognize the threat level inside the question. Now, I'm not saying that every question is threatening, but I'm saying that many times what opens up or shuts down a conversation is that we ask a question without acknowledging what the threat level is in that moment. Students may be threatened by their answer if they are competitive questions. This is one place where a lot of times they feel like they have to have the right answer. We're back to the factual. So, if you ask, what is the reason Jesus challenged the Pharisees? Whoa, now you could have, let's go find, I call it the concordance battle. Now that we have Bible software, we don't talk about those massive concordances in the back of study Bibles like we used to have. But that's when all of a sudden people go in the back of the Bible, look up Pharisee, and they start looking at all the passages, and everybody's looking for the one right answer, right? It's just, what are some reasons Jesus challenged the Pharisees? Now we don't have a competition finding the one right answer. Intimate questions, the risk of self-disclosure. I've already talked about this one. I mean, it is one thing to say is, how are Christians tempted to sin daily? It's another thing to say, how are we, as a class, as a small group, tempted? My friend, the young man that I started with at the beginning, how are you tempted to sin daily? Yeah, that's a pretty intimate conversation. Now, there may be a moment that's important. I'm going to suggest that in just a couple of minutes. But the timing of that question may be more important than anything else. It's what kind of level of intimacy are we asking through our questions? Probably mixed messages a lot of times is one of the real concerns. And Garrett, I'm still thinking about your response. In some ways, that was almost a mixed message. In other words, for two people, for one, it was value. The other, it was just still productive, and they were just kind of giving a general answer. But it communicated a mixed message as a result of that. And the misunderstanding. Evaluative questions become fact-finding questions. Sometimes I've actually used this question one time, and I wish I hadn't. It was, what does the Bible say about divorce? And all of a sudden I had 5 people finding four different passages, and then we had a major battle of which of those passages had priority. It's like asking, what color should the carpet be in the sanctuary? You're already in trouble the minute you ask the question, because they thought I was asking them to go look up every one of the factual statements about divorce, and then let's have the battle. And it's not a thing to say, how does God's love or law in the Bible help us to understand divorce? Now I'm asking a question that's still analytical. It's not go find what are the 5 Bible passages on divorce, but it's really thinking, what does this mean? And it's just a different way. And crafting that question so you go for what you want, whether it's an analytical versus fact-finding, but say it in such a way that they don't get a good mixed message is really important. I'm often, and I'm not always good at my initial question, so I'm often asking people, would you like me to restate that? Because a lot of times what I ask and how they hear is different. And I've given, my Sunday school class has permission. They know that sometimes I'm going really fast because I tend to teach very short studies. We spend a lot of time in prayer, and then we do very intense study for about 15, 20 minutes. But I always start with questions. So a lot of times if I open with a question and they don't quite understand it, they know, Dean, can you say that another way? And I've recognized that forces me to rethink. As a matter of fact, one of the things you can do is ask your question to yourself two or three different ways, and then pick the right way out of those you think that's most clear. Or productive can be analytical. Now this may sound kind of weird, and I've got a screen up here, but one of the things I often coach is, how do you write answers on the board when you're asking, like an open-ended question? And if I took a moment, well, I'll just do it this way. On the side of this board, a lot of times people give us an answer and they'll go, well, that's the first one, and then this is the second one, and this is the third answer. And what does that communicate to people when you go down a line like that? Priority. And a lot of times people race so they can get to the top of the board, right? So what I tend to do on a whiteboard or a chalkboard is I tend to write answers all over the place in different ways. And so one answer may look like this, and then the next person I'll go all the way to the bottom of the board and change the angle, and then I'll probably do a third one in the middle of the board and a fourth one on the side. And what you're doing is saying all these answers are important because they're not prioritized linearly. And then what's really fun is to say, where are the connections? And then see people, if I'm doing board work, which doesn't happen a lot of times, watching people, and I'll circle a couple of them and then kind of connect them this way, and this one will go to that this way. And what you've done is just by the way you write down their responses, you're getting them to think about different ways in which their answers can connect to each other. I hope you hear, in a way, I am, just by the way I write the answers, I might send a mixed message. Not because of what you intend, but because a lot of times the way, particularly children and youth and some adults, have been socialized. We know that a lot of adults are fearful about answering questions because the only time they've been asked them in the past is for evaluation. Both in school, but also a lot of times on the job site, right? We're about to go through a performance review. Oh, wonderful. And so the way in which I've organized material, the response to those questions sometimes, is just saying to them, everybody's still a part of this conversation. I hope that makes sense. One other thing that I think is really important is the climate of trust. This one is really a tough one, and it depends on the age level, but a lot of times if you have a kind of sort of uneven kind of affirmation or recognition, it does create sort of a different level of perceived trust and intimacy. Now, this one's hard. It's not even whether the questions are asking, but how we're responding to them. I'm sure all of you, I teach for a living, I'm sure all of you have been to a class where you've had a professor at some point say, I'm really asking this question in general, what do people think? But you know there's one right answer, right? You know there is the Sunday school answer in there somewhere. And you can almost tell, they'll go, yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I hate that word, right? Oh, yeah, that sounds plausible. Well, thank you for that moment of real deep affirmation at that moment. And they're waiting. It's almost like a game show for the right answer to arrive. Yes, now I can start talking again because I'm the most important person in the room. And I was really only using you to set me up. One of the reasons the very thing I used at the beginning, many times I'll say that I will tell people up front. I mean, I know they have been socialized. They've been shaped and formed by schooling environments where for some adults, particularly if they've had very negative experiences in the classroom, even as you're trying to do this as a small group leader, the first thing they're thinking, the back of their brain is, yeah, you're asking questions, but we know. It's just a bait and switch. You're just setting us up. And so I will tell them, the very thing I said to you, I am not looking for a right answer. Sometimes I may be honest with them and say that some answers may be more right than others, but I'm not looking for one. And then I have to discipline myself. I've had at times to pick a response that might not have been the one I had hoped for. Because we ask questions and we do have answers in mind. I think we have to be honest to ourselves as teachers. Because we want them to be changed by the information. We want them to be transformed through that. But sometimes I have to say, I know that response is not the best response, but it's good enough for me to continue the conversation because it's as important for that person to know they're valued in that moment as it is for me to get to the right answer that quickly. Does that make sense? And how you create that environment, do all children, and I'd say youth, and even adults give an opportunity to respond. This is why a lot of times I do, the equivalent of a neighbor nudge, even with children and with youth, and say, I'm going to ask a question. I want you to answer that to your friend next to you. And I keep, and then that way everybody has a chance to give a response. And then I'm going to say, then I would say to them, and then often I'll say, particularly youth and above, and what did you hear that you liked? Or what did you hear that surprised you? And it's not even their answer, they're reporting on somebody else's. Or what did you hear, and this is a phrase that dates me, that was cool. I try not to, even the like question I'm trying to be careful with, but I want them to speak affirmingly of other people. So I don't say to them, what did you hear that you dislike? Well, yeah, Johnny over here is dumb as a box of rocks, and this is what he said. But I'm trying to think of ways that they know that every response is important. And reacting, I've always said this, is really kind of avoiding the okay, or wrong. I have used wrong on a couple of occasions, but that's only if I have a really good relationship with the people. But there are times when I get something really bizarre, particularly the rabbit trail, and I'll say, I really haven't thought about it that way. And that's normally a fair response because I really haven't thought about it that way when I hear it. But it helps them. You can say that's an interesting or a different way of describing what we're talking about, and in naming it that way, you can even say what other kinds of responses, or what are some other ways. And so you're not invalidating that, you're acknowledging it, but you're helping then continue the conversation. Valuative things. I've really learned with valuative responses and open-ended things to say, that one is interesting, maybe something we need to come back to as we consider this. But let's, and it's just a way of kind of reminding people that we all don't have to get invested in that answer at that moment, but how are some other ways people might respond as a result of it? Does that make sense? Here's some pointers. These are just kinds of things to think about. I'm rushing through the content. I'm recognizing that. So let me pause for a second. Any comments or questions on what I've already presented before I walk through this slide? Anything?
Do you suggest that you go from general down to specific
Yeah.
all the time?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, and there'll be a slide later, but I really like to start most of my classes, and I tend to work with adults, but I'd say it's also important with youth, that it's better to open a lesson at the broad end and then gradually bring it down to the community level, and then toward the end of the lesson bring it down to personal application. And what I tend to see is that lessons that tend to go south, and particularly with adults, in some ways go the other direction. They start very personal right up front. Though I'll offer some places where that still is okay. But they'll start very personal, and then they force that to fit the context. And then they go say, well, so what is that going to look like in the world at large as a result of it? But it still starts with your personal decision. So I like lessons that start with kind of open-ended discussions at the broadest audience, because no one has to get invested. And then we gradually move over time down the journey. I always try to finish with a personal comment because I want them leaving thinking about it in relationship to their life. Not always wrestling, but sometimes accepting the challenge so that they know they're in this conversation. But at least at that point, it's a better way of kind of making the movement. Okay? Other comments or questions? Knowing that we had different age levels might be present, I'd just throw some things out. One is productive questions are really good before whatever you're teaching. I use the language of story here, but you could say the lesson, the scripture passage. I like the productive. They're really good at the open-ended side of it. The kind of brainstorming stuff is really good before you actually introduce the lesson, because you can set a good broad context that then the lesson might speak into in different ways. Often if we have one right answer in mind, we set that up so far early that we ourselves are not surprised by the very scripture we're teaching. And if you keep it open-ended and more productive, you get opportunities to actually hear how that scripture might be used in different ways. But factual ones really are important a lot of times after the lesson to reinforce the message. This is really important with children, but it's also a lot of times helpful with youth and adults, is just to say at the end of, and if you're using a video assist, or you've just reviewed a lesson that they've done together, or you've just covered a piece of scripture, kind of saying, so what are the 2 or 3 big points that the writer of the lesson, the presenter, is trying to make? And you're not asking for interpretation. With adults, you almost always get that. But even if you hear that, you go, where did you hear that in the presentation? Where did you see that in the lesson? I mean, where did you find that in the scripture passage we just read together? It's just a way of reinforcing what's important in the message itself. And so I don't mind factual questions or analytic sometimes, but particularly factual questions right after the content that's been presented. In adult classes with lots of discussion, that's normally the best time to kind of make sure everybody gets oriented so the rabbit trails don't start too quickly. It's just a subtle way, not to manipulate people, but to remind people we have a message today. We have a story, something here that we're being asked to deal with. Actually, factual questions build confidence with children. One of the things I think are good, if these are, and I call these bunny rabbit lobs, but when you ask children factual questions that they can answer, that would mean they've been attentive enough. Then a lot of times if they answer 1 or 2 of those well, particularly young children, it gives them the confidence then to put themselves out there. And I hope you hear that takes some skill, and sometimes those factual questions may be something like work on a piece of paper. I mean, it is a question, so write down 3 things that Jesus says out of this passage, and then in some ways there may be 10 or 12, but they all come from the passage. You can build confidence in those in children, so you can go forward. But I often say use productive questions with kids also. Let them do some brainstorming. Good children's leaders I know are not threatened themselves by that, because sometimes you get the famous, the old television show that's gone through at least 2 iterations, Art Linkletter and then Bill Cosby, and I'm trying to think of the most recent version of it where kids say the darndest things. And I can't think of the name of the show that's out recently where the kids have talent. But most of the time kids can be productive, and if you can just let that productivity just affirm them and who they are, it really helps them stay motivated as a part of that lesson. So let them think outside the box every once in a while. It doesn't always have to be Jesus for the best way. Always remember the threat level, even with children. I tend not to ask children extremely personal questions unless I have a strong relationship with them. And even then, I tend to, if I ask them a personal question, I tend not to ask children to answer that in a public setting. But to think about it, to reflect upon it, to talk to mom and dad about it, that kind of thing. Because for children to kind of give you, they're already struggling with their own identity and having cognitively a way of thinking about that. So they may blurt anything out. And the only way they know whether or not that was appropriate is in the feedback they get. And so I would rather do that more in smaller groups or with an adult. This is one place where if you have a kind of personal question with children as a part of a Sunday school lesson, it may be thinking about how many adults can I have in the room so they can talk to an adult and the adults know to give a positive response to that. It's just one of those kinds of things. Eventually you will need to ask personal questions with kids, just like you do everybody, but you always have to be careful how you handle those. One of the things that we've discovered in research is kids actually respond better to questions when they're given a task, like writing. There was some phenomenal research where they were doing a series of qualitative interviews. That's a fancy language, but they were doing research with children and trying to understand their view of the world. And when they would sit down with the child and look across them and ask it, the kids were very reticent, or they tended to give short replies. But if a child is coloring, if they're playing, if they're otherwise engaged, they'll talk for a real long period of time. This really surprised workers. And so a lot of times you maximize the questions by, well, particularly with kids, if they have something else to be doing at the same time. And youth, I'm not quite sure if that's the same way. Crayons maybe, but nowadays with they're on their smartphones. I'm not sure that qualifies the same way. But with children, at least writing or drawing is important. Oh, excuse me. Computer later. Well, my computer died on me for a second. Hang on a second. And right back to the show. What we've already talked about, I think, is important. I think it really is helpful to set a pattern in how you use questions within a given ministry. If you're doing a small group, or if you're doing a youth ministry or an adult, it really does help them. It gives them a comfort level if they know the way you're going to ask questions. So I do tend to follow starting in general and avoiding the evaluation at the beginning, and then moving to personal. So I normally start with the broadest community, and then I do bring it down to my class, the adult Sunday school class I teach, and then I go down to, and where are you in light of this lesson, normally at the end. My class that I teach, I've been teaching now for 10 years, both for good or for ill. What's interesting is they've gotten the rhythm of the way I ask questions. So they're already in the room ready to engage. And so I normally start by asking a productive question of, so how is sin active in the world around us? What do we tend to see? Or how's the media in general cause us to lead to temptation? Then I move to a slightly analytical, well, why are these responses? What's going on behind them? But I hope you hear it's still a kind of general thing. And so I start with open-ended, and I go to a kind of problem-solving mode. And then it's like, so how does the passage, the scripture, speak to whatever we've talked about up to this point? And then, so what's our sort of understanding of that? Now I'm asking for interpretation. And then finally, and what difference does this make in your life? And my class has gotten so used to my pattern that they're not threatened by the questions because they understand the flow. Now, they probably couldn't sit down and diagram it, but it's funny. I've watched my class. I've changed it up a couple of times, and I've watched my class try to drag me back into the very way I teach because they like it. I mean, it allows them to come in. It doesn't matter what the subject is. They're pretty relaxed to begin with. They know they're going to have permission to offer lots of things. They know there's going to be a moment when, as a class, we're going to be challenged together, and I'm going to be right there with them. And then they recognize that I am going to probably put them on the spot toward the end of the lesson, either explicitly or implicitly, but then they have the opportunity to deal with that. And I get really amazing conversations with my adults after the lesson because they've had enough time to absorb what we're talking about that now they really do want to deal with it personally. Does that make sense? But there are moments I change it up. Once you do that kind of a pattern, if you walk in one day and you go, so where are you in this journey? Whoa, something's going on. It almost changes the, not so much threat, now it's expectation. If they trust you, now where's the teacher going today? It's just a different way of doing it. So I would encourage you, when it comes to questions, to think about a pattern, how that would look. I do use personal productive to tap student experiences, and what I mean by that is sometimes I'll say, can you get, and I normally I try to be it's very important to think of positive experiences. So if we're talking about not so much sin and temptation, but we're talking about God's grace, I may start a lesson saying, where did you see God's grace this week? Now that's personal, but it's also productive, because by then I can get a popcorn of lots of positive responses, and it's coming right out of people. And then I can move to that kind of collective we to saying, wonder why God's grace isn't as evident in other people's lives in general. What is it that they might not see that we were able to see last week? Now they're in a kind of analytic kind of mode, and I hope you're hearing. Now, what does God say to us about grace? And let's take a look at the passage for today. And then toward the end, I could say, how can we help other people name grace in their lives? And what is one person you know that you think maybe you could come alongside this week and help them name the same grace that you talked about or we talked about as a class at the very beginning of this lesson. So I'm still using questions in a particular way, but it's guiding them to a preferred kind of outcome when it's all said and done. Give quiet students a general question before class and ask for productive responses. I have had more with children's ministry, but sometimes when I was working in youth ministry, particularly junior high kids, middle school kids, who are just scared to death to be put on the spot. I've asked, on occasion, I've recruited them. I'd say, look, I got a lesson, and I really need some help. So can you help me get, I'm not sure how people are going to respond, so can you help me by working on this and kind of helping the rest of the class start to respond? And by enlisting them and keeping it open-ended enough, then even a quiet student can actually offer things. They've had time to think about it, and they've had time, if they don't run away, they've had time to feel like they're contributing. They know that, and it's just a good way for them to begin to offer answers, and they know that's important for them. I do let students come up with questions, and this is all age levels, but I'm going to be frank with you. I don't sometimes do that in the moment. I call that Q&A boxes. Nowadays, it's text me the questions that you have or send me an email, and that way I get to pre-filter those. And that keeps from people using questions to say audacious things or evaluative things. And that's, again, where a neighbor nudge sometimes is also important. You let them tell it to somebody else, and all you're doing is creating a very small buffer so that by the time you hear those questions, they're not on the spot. So that's an important thing to think about. This is my last slide, and then if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I really do encourage, if you've done, even if you've taught a lot, that you practice writing and rehearsing questions. I think a lot of times, particularly if we use existing curriculum, a lot of times we'll select questions out of that, but I would encourage you to kind of make this as much a practice. If you are a teacher and you spend a lot of time studying the Bible in time to present it, do you also spend time in thinking through the questions you're going to ask and thinking about how they sound? You can use icons, the ones I have here. I mean, this is very low tech. You can use emojis if you want to in these days, but I just use a plus sign for factual, $sign for analytic, an exclamation for productive, and a hashtag for evaluative. And sometimes, if I'm working with a lesson that I really feel could go way off the rails, either because it's going to create lots of rabbit trails or it's going to make lots of people angry. If I'm dealing with a very sensitive subject, I will not only write my questions out, I will tag them. And I'd recommend, even if it's not a difficult thing, if you do this for a couple of months and then sit down and just look back through the symbols and ask yourself, what's my spread when it comes to these 4 different types of questions? How do I understand how they work? Most of the time, if you're like me, you tend to teach the way you like to learn. And I think we all do. And I want you to hear, that's okay, because that's teaching out of our strength. But that also means there are other people in our classrooms who may not learn the same way we do. And so keeping track of the way we ask questions, sometimes in saying, well, what if somebody learns differently? may force you to reorient your questions for the sake of some of the kids or some of the youth or adults in your room at the same time. So it's just a way of kind of self-monitoring your own use and then diversifying it. I always recognize that some questions are blended. I think the example of asking an open-ended question that becomes evaluative, or that sometimes analytical questions assume certain facts are known as a result of that, and you might ask for analysis and recognize that the facts aren't quite straight in the way the material's been communicated, and so you just know that's going to happen. And I really do encourage this last one. Have someone in the class that you trust monitor your questions. Now, I don't mean every week. In my life, that normally is my wife. And I get a pretty quick evaluation at the end of every time I teach in church, which is actually, sometimes it's constructive, other times that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. But I would encourage you, if you've got somebody, if you're teaching an adult class, maybe somebody who serves as a fill-in, because this is a good way for you to be teaching them how to teach. If you're working in youth and children, if you have an assistant, and you just ask them, help monitor. How would you hear in the questions today? And how the flow of the questions went. And that's a great way for you to be self-aware. We most of the time teach not on the fly, but we're a little more impromptu, which is okay. I mean, if I spent, I know I followed my PowerPoints pretty close, but if I spent all my time reading the questions I'm going to ask, I'm already in trouble, because I'm not looking in people's eyes. I'm not asking them those questions. I'm merely asking the question I want to hear. And so I hope you understand that even though I've done all this work, I may set that to the side in the flow of what's going on. And that's why it's really good to have somebody else kind of keeping tabs on what you're asking so that they can help you see, in your most natural state, how do those questions tend to come across. Okay? Any closing questions from anybody here? Anything? Observations from what I've presented? Concerns? All right. Famous phrase, all hearts clear? More importantly, everybody hungry? Now that's a factual question, and I know the answer to that one. Well, thank you for coming. I hope this is helpful. And again, if you're curious about the PowerPoint, this is one of those kinds of sessions hopefully you can take back to your churches, to your youth groups, with the people you're working with, to your Sunday school ministries, and be able to communicate it. So you can email me, or if you just try to reach out to me through SDMI, the United States Canada SDMI office, I'm sure we can get you a PDF of the PowerPoints so that you'd have that information. Okay? Let me close with just a word of prayer. All right? Gracious God, I thank you. Thank you that in a way, each of us in our own journey, there's a moment in which, by the power of your Spirit, you have spoken a direct question in our lives, a personal question, a question that really asks us, who do we call Lord? And in our response to you, you've imparted to us saving grace. And so I know those personal questions, Lord, are important, and they've been important for each and every one of us. But Lord, I also give thanks that the way you've lifted up our horizon to look at students that we teach and to help us think about them and their journey. And I thank you that everybody here is here because they really want to make a difference in other people's lives. Thank you for the way they're invested in the lives of students and the way in which your grace flows through them for the sake of those students' salvation. Pray that in our reflections upon this presentation, that your Spirit will use them so that whatever we learn today is not merely for our sake, but ultimately in service to your kingdom. Give us a good lunch and help us continue this day. In Christ's name, amen. Blessings, guys.